Thanks, Mike. I'm going to keep it really short. So I'm Vice President for Programs. I mean, I have to line up the presentations, basically, and I'm the Director of the Arizona Geological Survey, if you don't know me. But I have lots of openings for talks next year, so if you're interested in giving a talk, please reach out to me. I'd love to have, I'd like to have a nice variety of different kinds of talks. And so far we have, and I like keeps it interesting, I think. So tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Carson Richardson, who is Senior Research Geologist and head of the Arizona Geological Survey and head of our Mineral Resources Program and mapping, although we hope that he's segueing out of that a little bit. But the Mineral Resources Program, which has really picked up a lot since we hired Carson, started full-time in 2019, beginning, yeah. So we're doing a lot more with mineral resources now than we had done for a long time. So really, he's done a great job. He has a master's and PhD from geosciences here at the University of Arizona. So at that, he's going to talk about critical minerals in Arizona. So come on over.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, this is his he gave half of a talk earlier this year, so this is really a bonus, him giving another talk.
Yes, I initially declined this talk 3 or 4 times, and then somehow one of those no's became a yes, and here I am. But so I'll be talking today about the energy transition, critical minerals, and kind of how they'll be sourced. Really, a better title is Ramblings on Critical Minerals. This is largely it's a modification, but it's a talk I've given a lot of times to non-geoscientists. Basically, what are critical minerals? Why should we care about them? And how are they relevant to Arizona? So I should first point out that most of this was recently published in the latest issue of Arizona Geology in an article titled Critical Materials and Minerals in the State. Not a scientific talk, and as many of us in the audience knows, economic geologists, jack of all trades, master of none. So just to throw that out there to start with. So we'll start with going through some definitions. What are critical minerals? What are strategic minerals? What are minerals versus materials? The history of these in the United States, looking then at Arizona's critical mineral deposits or resources, and then kind of future demand scenarios, obstacles, and how we might contribute to the energy transition. So let's start with some definitions here. If you've noticed in the last few years, we've suddenly started talking about critical minerals. Prior to around 2015 or so, the only time you'd ever hear about mining in the news was effectively when there was an opposition group trying to protest the opening of a mine. However, since 2015 and really picking up steam around 2017, 2018, we suddenly have a lot of publications that are talking about the fact that we need metals to be able to combat climate change, secure energy independence, and not be reliant on foreign countries for resources that we may not be producing domestically. Antimony is a great example. In 1980, we were producing roughly half of the needed antimony that the United States required. In 2024, that is now 83%. And in fact, we have no domestic antimony production. We only get 17% of our antimony in the US through recycling. Presently, there's no domestic production. Oh yeah, just said that. Half of our antimony is supplied from China. Globally, about 48% of antimony used worldwide is from China. And 30% of our resources are supplied from other countries. We use antimony for a number of things: ammunition, flame retardants. It helps with the production of ceramic glass and rubber products. And in August of this year, China's Commerce Ministry imposed export limits on antimony, stating that they wanted to encourage non-proliferation around the world and retain antimony for national security interests on their part. We think about the green energy transition. What that means is we need a lot more metal, and we need it now. A wind farm, for each copper turbine, you need roughly a ton of copper. For solar generating facilities, you need kilometers of copper piping. Hybrid vehicles require twice the amount of copper as a traditional combustion engine. Electric, 3 to 4 times that. EV charging stations, depending on which make you want to go with, anywhere from 1.5 to 18 pounds of copper. This is just copper. If we look at other things, such as this chart here down on the other right, this basically is all pointing out if we were to tomorrow convert to 100% EV vehicles for the entire for the entire globe, this would be the sudden change that we would need to be able to make that happen. we need roughly 300% more lithium immediately, 2,000% more cobalt, huge increases in rare earths and graphite, copper, only 22% more, but we just need a huge amount of materials suddenly, and we can't do that overnight. The good thing about metals versus using petroleum resources is these are durable metals that last for a long time, are reusable compared to one-time combustion fossil fuels. We get long lives out of these things. Copper that we mine out of Butte or Yarrington are still powering places across the globe here. They're still being used, and we can tear down those houses and reuse that copper. So a number of these first figures you're going to see are from a website called visualcapitalist.com. They make a bunch of great figures that are really useful ways to look at kind of the metals market. So this is showing the early 2018 critical minerals list and basically colorizing it by how much we depend on foreign sources to obtain that versus domestic. So the hotter colors, as you go down to over here, these are all resources that we are 100% reliant on other countries to supply those metals. And then these darker colors here are ones that we actually are net exporters at. And the basic way we calculate this is we take imports minus exports, divide that by consumption. That gives us what's called the net imports reliance. And that's how the USGS has determined roughly what critical minerals are indeed critical or not. And 50% is the rough cutoff we've been using for a while. So in 2018, the first critical minerals list was released. And we'll come into the minerals versus metals versus elements question in a second. But I've taken that and just kind of plotted it on the periodic table so we can look at how these things compare. In 2018, we released 35 elements on critical minerals. And of course, there's more than 35 elements here because they lumped all the lanthanides and the PGEs together. And so if you add that together, that's 35. 2022, we added nickel and zinc. We took off potassium, strontium, rhenium, and uranium. And in 2023, the DOE released what's called the critical materials list, which covered most of the critical minerals, but also added things such as iron, copper, and silica. In Arizona, we are active producers for uranium, rhenium, copper, and helium. We've produced a number of other commodities, such as zinc, vanadium, manganese, and et cetera, previously. We have resources for many of these other commodities here. We have inventories, which are basically best guesses that we think we have this, but we've actually not done a full mineral resource, so don't make financial decisions based on these colors here. And we have some others that also have occurrences, where we know they're in the state, but we're not sure if they actually could add up to much. Additionally, many of these commodities we could potentially recover as byproducts from porphyry copper systems. So if you just consider where Arizona sits in critical mineral space, we have a lot of potential here. So we can translate that into this map here that just shows, okay, where are the major deposits in Arizona? How do they kind of key versus these different metal types? And you can see, obviously, that copper dominates here. And if you're interested in these figures, I mean, you're welcome to take pictures here. These are all from the publication I referenced at the start here. So moving to actual definitions. Well, the earliest definitions we had were basically strategic versus critical. Strategic really meaning these had military applications. They're essential to national defense. We had a high degree of import reliance during wartime, and they were subject to incredibly strict controls on their use and distribution. Critical originally meant that they're more fundamental to industry or economic activity, but not necessarily have military applications. But it was also a somewhat hierarchical definition, so it also meant that it was less important than the strategic minerals at first. There were still degrees of control in their use. There were some resources around, but the earliest definitions were strategic is the most important, then critical. That fell to the wayside as time went on. Obviously, everything we looked at just a bit ago were elements, or plotting everything as elements. Again, minerals are these naturally occurring compounds that contain the critical elements that we care about. Materials are really engineered products that contain that critical mineral or element. These are factual definitions. The key thing I would like to really point out to everyone is critical mineral has taken off with the public. People hear that and they kind of understand what you're talking about. Let's meet them where we're at and use that term and not argue about, well, these are actually critical elements and not critical minerals. They can actually talk about mining for once. Let's keep running with that. In December 2017, President Trump signed Executive Order 13817, which effectively defined the definition of critical minerals as non-fuel mineral or mineral material essential to economic and national security of the United States, derived from a supply chain that is vulnerable to disruption, and serves an essential function in the manufacturing of a product, the absence of which would have substantial consequences to the economy or national security. That following May, the first critical minerals list was released, this one that we looked at right here. And then in the Energy Act of 2020, critical minerals had effectively a similar designation where it's like, okay, anything that the director of the USGS or the Secretary of the Interior says is critical, we'll go with it. Critical materials were defined as a non-fuel mineral element substrate or material that the Secretary of Energy determines to have a high risk of supply chain disruption and serves an essential function in one or more energy technologies. So that includes technologies that transmit, store, and conserve energy, and all critical minerals are automatically critical materials. So we end up with this final chart here, is when you combine the two together. The other way to think about this, the DOE has to accept all USGS critical minerals. The USGS does not. So all critical minerals are automatically critical all critical minerals are automatically critical materials, but not the inverse. So that's just kind of a way to kind of capture these thoughts here for you. So moving on to the history, I spent a good 30 or 45 minutes trying to find an old-timey font to just make this look original here. So I just really want to highlight that was more difficult than I expected. In June 7th, 1776, this resolution was passed by the Continental Congress and circulated to each colony. The article of lead is so essentially necessary to us at this juncture, and is withal so scarce that no pain should be spared to procure it. The situation of the United Colonies will be extremely deplorable if we depend entirely upon the importation of it. Before we were even a country, we were concerned about how we get minerals and metals to be able to survive and to function as a society here. This was something that's in our DNA at the very get-go. So this resolution was passed, and every colony was told, go find more lead mines. We need them now. Numerous mines opened, and almost immediately all shut, because they ended up not being very good deposits. So a lot of the colonies started looking at other sources, what we would now call recycling, and we started to be able to provide some domestic lead production that way. So we took things apart such as clocks, windows, and statues. This is a painting of the statue of King George III in New York City being pulled down about a month after the resolution was passed, where some overzealous members of the Continental Army started pulling it apart. This was a gilded statue where it's mostly lead with a gold gild around it. And it was melted down and formed into 40,000 musket balls. However, not the entire statue was melted down, because here's a little bit of the tail left that has made it into the New York Historical Society here. The first official list of critical materials and minerals was put together by a geologist with the last name of Leith during World War II. He was an advisor to the War Industries Board, and his list was effectively, here are some critical and strategic materials. His critical ones were all the ones in bold here, and the unbolded ones were things that were less strategic and more critical here, I should say. The bolded ones were his strategic ones. Following World War I, a general by the last name of Harbord put together the Harbord list, which was a list of critical materials and strategic materials, all the things that they noticed during wartime we did not have good access to. And we have a real, hodgepodge of things here. Things that are actual minerals, arsenic, antimony. We have materials, coconut shells, silk, food, coffee, there was another good food one in here, palm oil, commodities, linseed oil, And then drugs. We need a good amount of opium during wartime as well here. So this was a really, expansive list that concluded anything that we might really be looking for during a time of crisis. During the interwar years, in 1938, the first Stockpiling Act was passed, where Congress gave $4 million to the US Navy and said, start stockpiling now. The following year, a National Stockpiling Act was passed in 1939. Several stockpiles were established. They were trying to encourage additionally domestic production and exploration of mines and deposits. However, there was very little actual stockpiling that happened prior to entry into World War II. And in 1942, the War Production Board was organized to assume responsibility for obtaining and allocating resources across the nation. And the War Production Board was a really efficient and interesting organization. There were numerous funding mechanisms to increase domestic resources during this time. Those mechanisms fed into private industry as well as into federally operated facilities. One of the things they did was they stationed USGS and university geologists at a lot of the small mines that normally did not have staff to find ore and to increase production at those sites. They were doing everything they could just to squeeze out a little bit more from these small, more mom and pop operations. They additionally funded a number of exploration programs. The original Salmon Well mine, which had at the time 27 million tons at 0.8% copper, was discovered thanks to funding from the War Production Board and the Federal Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Following the end of World War II, the Strategic and Critical Materials Stockpiling Act of 1946 was passed, so expanding that stockpiling program, trying to encourage more domestic production, exploration, and development. Another Defense Production Act was passed in the 1950s, largely in response to the Korean War. And that really also formalized federal support for mining in the form of loans and guarantees of purchases of metals at certain set prices. A good example of how that's helped out is that the Yarrington Porphyry copper mine only went into production due to the fact that there were major tax incentives that were from the federal government, and the feds agreed that they would purchase a large amount of ore at above market rates in the event that the ore did not sell on the open market. So by having that dangle in front of them, companies were willing to put something into production and move forward. The uranium boom obviously kicked off following the end of World War II. The Manhattan Project at the time obtained uranium largely from three sources: the El Dorado mine in northern Canada, I'm not going to butcher this mine's name, in the Belgian Congo, and from vanadium tailings along the Colorado Plateau. In 1946, the Atomic Energy Commission was established, and this really led to a period of rapid interest in uranium, where we really were helping to set up this nascent industry that was trying to get on its own feet very quickly and prop up the industry as it grew. There was the major uranium rush across the plateau, looking at the sandstone-hosted uranium vanadium deposits as well as the uranium breccia pipes. In the 1970s, there was the National Uranium Resource Evaluation Program established, tasked with identifying uranium resources, undiscovered uranium resources across the US. Huge diversity of tasks and projects that were funded on this. This program was terminated in 1980. Last bits of it were wrapped up in 1984, but the data that this was developed is still being used today. This was a hugely successful program, a lot of great value that we're still getting out of this data that we did in the 1970s here. For those of you that are newer to mining, you may not be aware that 20, 30 years ago, there was a U.S. Bureau of Mines. That bureau was shuttered during the Clinton administration in 1996, with the large-scale economics and statistics aspects transferred to the USGS. And while there has continued to be mineral resource work done at the USGS, we really did see a large step away from mining-specific research done at the federal level for quite a while as a result of that. We had ore deposit geology continuing, but not as much kind of mining thinking. Then, in 2017, the executive order tasked with the critical minerals list being developed. In fiscal year 2019, Congress appropriated $9.6 million to establish the Earth Mapping Resources Initiative, and that appropriation has continued at $10.6 million a year. Their goal has been to run major geophysical surveys over prospective areas, acquire high-resolution LiDAR, conduct new geologic mapping both by the USGS and state surveys in areas of mineral potential, and run regional geochemical sampling campaigns. Additionally, this program was supercharged thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure bill, where it gave them an additional $320 million over 5 years to really elevate the level of science and kind of just the diversity of tasks they can go after here. So just to kind of show this figure here, these are all the prospective areas that all the states are interested in. We're not working on every single one of them, but we are tackling a lot of different things across the board here right now. It's a good time to be at a state survey. So moving now into critical metal deposits in Arizona. We saw this graph earlier. We'll start with the most obvious one. Let's look at the porphyries here. So here is a graph of production of copper in Arizona and in the United States over the last, 150 years or so. This data is compiled by Dave Briggs and then kind of drafted up by myself here. Since 1988, annually, Arizona produces 10% of copper nationwide. Since 1960, we produce at minimum 50% of copper for the US. Typically, the level is something more like 60 to 70%, but we are the leader when it comes to copper. These numbers might be slightly out of date, but in general, if you look at the major copper mines, we have 9 active mines, 9 closed or inactive mines, 5 development projects, and using rough data up till 2020, there was approximately 150 billion pounds of copper that had been mined in the state. In 2012, a paper that Ralph Stegan and Rich Lavelle put together gave a rough number of roughly 480 billion pounds of a known copper endowment in Arizona. That's inclusive of past mined copper as well as economic mineralization and resources and reserves. So roughly we've mined a third of the known copper at that time. However, increased copper prices can obviously make uneconomic or sub-economic prospects economic suddenly, so that endowment can and likely will grow over time. For molybdenum, we recover that from most deposits in the state. 8 of the 9 active mines recover moly, 5 of the 9 closed ones recovered moly, and 4 of the 5 development projects have a moly resource. However, compared to copper, it's a byproduct of copper mining. It's not the main metal. So we don't see huge ups and downs here. We see fairly steady production over time in the state. What we do see with the huge up and downs elsewhere in the state is because when the moly-only mines close or go inactive for a while, that's a huge drop because they're where their ores are primary moly, while Arizona just keeps trucking along. Rhenium is a great example when we want to think about critical minerals. So it's a byproduct of a byproduct. We get rhenium from molybdenite, moly grades in most Arizona copper deposits, roughly from 1/1000th to 0.05%. Rhenium grades are typically 1/200th to 1/500th or 5,000th of that. So it's a tiny fraction of a fraction. Sierrita is the only Arizona mine with facilities designed to recover rhenium. Until recently, about 15 to 20% of rhenium was obtained from Sierrita alone. In the last few years, we don't have healthy enough statistics from the USGS to be able to say what that number currently is. But we recover rhenium from Sierrita, Baghdad, and Morenci. Rhenium is present at very different grades at most copper mines across the state, but it's probably the best way we can emphasize how we could easily meet critical mineral production. If you can just add on additional circuits to these mines and recover these small amounts of material at a large scale, that's a great way to get a lot of metal without opening a new pit. We just need to know which deposits have these critical minerals at elevated concentrations. So here's a brief compilation of kind of, what's the rough amount of rhenium in Arizona. So this data was put together by a paper by 2 USGS geologists in 2018, and then you can basically take that same data set and plot it for, what's the rhenium grade in moly versus, the moly grades, and use that to then calculate your rhenium grades later. But roughly we have, let's say, 4,000 tons of rhenium in Arizona porphyries alone. The average domestic production or domestic need for rhenium is around 35 tons per year. So if you divide those two numbers together, we could, if we recovered all the rhenium in Arizona, supply something like 115 years of rhenium just from this state alone. It's a great way that if we could just somehow get it from all these different mines, we could really, get a lot of bang for our buck here. Moving on to other metals, with lead and zinc, we typically have been fairly minor players at the national scale. Our peak was in the 1940s, where we had up to 6% of total lead production in the US and 10% of zinc. Historically, lead is a byproduct of silver mining. Zinc we didn't recover until 1905 when we adapted new techniques derived from copper mining. And the major player historically has been the Iron King mine in Yavapai County, though Hermosa may obviously be our future here. And this slide is definitely out of date, but Hermosa is from a historic silver district. ASARCO had interest in what was then called hard shell in the 1980s. Arizona Mining discovered the Taylor deposit in 2015, and South 32 bought Arizona Mining for $1.3 billion in 2018. And Hermosa has several pieces, and I didn't have time to update the slide, but there's the Taylor deposit, there's the Clark deposit, and I believe they also have the Peak and possibly one or two other pieces at these days. So I think their mineral resource is larger now. For uranium, we have started mining uranium again in the state of Arizona. Pinyon Plain, owned by Energy Fuels, went into operation in December of this past year with a projected 28-month mine life, where they had a resource that was roughly 2.3 million pounds of U3O8. Obviously, you might have been reading about them in the news. They shipped their first ore in April or so to the White Mesa Mill, and then have been in a lot of dialogue and some controversy with the surrounding tribes because they don't necessarily want the ore shipped over their lands here. So they're in discussions with them and trying to figure out a way to move forward here. Additionally, we have two other deposits that have clearly defined resources outside the plateau, Workman Creek in Gila County, and then the Anderson deposit, which has roughly 32 million pounds of U3O8. Additionally, we have the breccia bipe occurrences throughout the entire plateau here. Moving on to lithium, largely we can think of it for the state as three major deposits or deposit types to consider. You have pegmatites, so we have this grade tonnage, wrong button, this grade tonnage diagram here, so low tonnage, high grade pegmatites, lots of rock, low grade brines, and then sedimentary lithium deposits are in the middle here. So we'll go through some of the possible examples. So the pegmatites have historically been mined in the White Picacho district and in occurrences in northwestern Arizona, and they have continued to attract a lot of interest in the last few years, especially in the historic White Picacho area. We have a number of deposits that are sedimentary lithium that are being actively explored. Wickiup and Basin, formerly Burrow Creek, have defined mineral resources up here in Mojave County. The Thompson Valley, which is the former Lyles clay deposit in Yavapai County, is being explored currently. And then the Wilcox Playa is being explored by a company called Max Power, where they have intersected a fair bit of sedimentary lithium out there. Additionally, Wilcox Playa has historically been considered as a lithium brine prospect, but as far as I'm aware, no one's drilled deep enough to be able to see if there's a deep lithium brine at depth there. With rare earth elements, historically, pegmatites is how we get them. Typically, those are the small, high-grade deposits, but we do have things such as La Paz in western Arizona, which has a resource of around 170 million tons of just under 400 ppm rhenium and 17 ppm scandium. It's been historically, it's been explored for the last few years, but I will confess I don't fully understand the geology of this deposit, so I can't speak much to it. Another one, potash, which got pulled in 2022 from a critical mineral, but what once was critical may yet be critical again, so I think we have to consider it. The Holbrook area is where we're best known for potash in the state of Arizona. That, of course, had the huge explosion in potash exploration in 2018 to roughly 2015 up there, where a number of mineral resources were defined at the time by two companies, Passport Potash, which was involved also with some work with the Hopi tribe, as well as American West. And collectively, if you add up all the resource that they put together there, there's 142 megatons of KCl. And just to throw this out here, because I think it's good then to remind ourselves that there are other types of things out here. If we think about aggregates, we're not leaders because you don't want to ship your aggregates across the nation. So really what you see with aggregates are you track with your population here. So yes, there's a bunch of more aggregate mining elsewhere, but that's because you don't want to buy your sand and gravel from Florida and ship it to California. And you can actually quite clearly see that, up until the financial crash in 2008 or so, aggregate production and population tracked fairly closely one-to-one, but we've yet to recover to pre-financial crash levels. So, moving to the last section here, demand scenarios, obstacles, and how we might contribute to the energy transition. Oh, I'm making good time. So, the energy transition requires a substantial increase in the amount of metal. We're going to see huge demands for this. Additionally, this is coupled with the fact that we have huge supply deficits that are projected. So we have to address the supply gap with several different methods. One, we can recycle. We can revisit old deposits for reprocessing, whether that is reprocessing the waste or reopening these pits, or we find new ore deposits. You could also throw substitution in here. You could find something else to work. Yeah, that's okay. But what are you going to substitute it with? A different metal. So you're just basically saying you have to deal with this with a different metal here. Additionally, this all has the opportunity for significant disruption due to geopolitical strife, social licensing, you want to have the community on board, and economics can really just disrupt these metal markets, kill the supply, and really leave us in the lurch. So if we look over here on these two diagrams, and I can't quite see it from my end of the platform, these are for, there's a lot of different demand scenarios out there, I will be honest. These are some of the cleanest ones in terms of being able to work with and actually make some nice looking plots. And this is from the International Energy Agency, and so they have data for copper, lithium, magnet rare earths, and a few other commodities, but here I only chose these three. So the way you can read this graph is the solid colors here at the bottom of each one are the amount of newly mined ore we can expect for these metals every year, projected into 2040. The vertical lines are showing here's our refining chemical processing capacity to handle. So with lithium and magnet rare earths, those are matched fairly closely to the amount of metal that we'll be mining every year. With copper, we see actually a significant increase, and that's because we already do a good job of recycling a lot of copper generally. So we have this extra capacity built in to kind of reprocess copper every year. The top line is, the solid top line is saying if we wanted to hit 2050 zero emission stated deadlines by various government agencies, that's how much metal we need every year. The dashed line is to say, let's not do that, let's just do whatever everyone has said already and just try to accomplish what we've already promised, is what the dashed line is. So you can obviously see just with that bit that there's this huge gap for all these commodities where we do not have enough material for copper, for lithium, or magnet rare earths to meet our future needs. Additionally, the gray area is shading what amount of this is from just energy transition technologies and related to that sort of demand versus their other aspects. So like traditional industry, and everything like that is just beneath here. We still have a supply gap by 2040 for copper, even if you ignore the entire energy transition. If you add the energy transition on top of that, we need a lot more metal really quickly. So I just wanted to make sure I walked through that chart here to make sure everyone could follow that. Of course, we have the awkward issue that we have no centralized planning entity that cares about how do we actually meet these needs. All agencies that are generally concerned with mining are only concerned with the permitting of mining or the regulation of mining when it's active. And that varies by land status. Who shows up to the door really depends as if you're in federal, state, or private land. The average amount of time it takes to open a mine is 29 years across the board. It's 31 years on average for copper mining. Additionally, what can really shoot us in the foot here is if there's any near-term oversupply issues, you see metal prices get depressed, that can cause a company to delay putting a mine into production, and that has been in the last few years locally the situation for several metals, such as copper, lithium, and nickel, where suddenly people are backing off projects because the metal prices aren't telling them to move forward. So if we're having to deal with that situation here, that really is going to be a challenge for us to actually be able to meet the needs to be able to implement the technologies we want to use if we're going to combat the climate crisis. There's more. We have a major talent gap. So this data is from 2019, But it was taking a look at 2029 when the youngest baby boomers will all be 65. So if they were all to retire out of the industry at once, we would have 130,000 less workers in the geosciences across the board than we did in 2029. There are major growths in these related fields. So we see things like mining support activities over here. This point's slightly off to the side, so I apologize every time. Mining support activities right here, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics slang for basically exploration and allied fields such as environmental hydrogeology, aspects that are specifically related to mining. So we're going to see, a third of the increase, 33% increase here. We see, a moderate decrease for oil and gas, 13%, and mining itself, if you're working in the pits, 5% increase. That's just geosciences. With mining engineering, we are not having enough people showing up at all either. In the US, we have, from 2015 to 2020, we saw a 40% drop in the number of mining engineer graduates in the United States. In Australia, they saw a 63% drop. We're at the point now where we need some sort of World War II-esque propaganda, getting people to show up to university to get trained to be geologists, to be mine engineers. Because if we don't have the people to do this, we are not meeting supply. This survey was done by the McKinsey Survey of Senior Leaders and Executives in 2022, where one choice expert quote from it is, mining companies are experiencing a talent squeeze. 71% of mining leaders are finding the talent shortage is holding them back from delivering on production targets and strategic objectives. This chart starts in 2023, the year after this was done. So if we are currently not meeting our targets, don't have enough people to put mines into production to be able to get these off the ground, how are we going to do this at the end? We have to address this talent crisis and shortage at the same time we have to deal with all this other stuff. So we have to consider different ways that we might be able to tackle this. One is that a lot of mines don't close because they're out of ore, but because of financial considerations. So just to point out the number of major closed mines in the state, Jerome closed in 53, Bisbee in 75, Christmas in 82, the Cactus Mine, formerly Sacaton, 1984, Ajo in 85, Salmon Well in 1999, Mineral Park in 2014, and Miami closed in 2015-ish, but still likes to report ore being recovered from stockpiles every year, it seems. So just think about Salmon Well. It's an hour drive north of Tucson, discovered in 42, as we talked about earlier, and opened in 1945, as an initially underground mine. Dave Lowell's first major discovery was there with the Kalamazoo deposit, and it was placed in care and maintenance in 1999 by BHP. Continued low copper prices through the early 2000s led the mine to be closed. The smelter and processing plants were demolished. The underground workings were flooded. And it was touted at the time as a successful closure and environmental reclamation, and rightfully so. A lot of people drive past this mine, don't even know it's there. However, it had a resource of 631 million tons at 0.64% copper that was unmined at the time. That's 8.9 billion pounds of copper. If you take pre-COVID copper prices of $2.50 a pound, that's 22 billion pounds of copper, $22 billion of copper. 380 or 450, you can get up to $40 billion worth of copper there. Granted, it would take a significant investment to reopen that and get it going, but there's probably still profit to be made there. Other mines that are looking at reopening, we have Cactus, formerly known as Sacaton, that is being advanced by the Arizona Sonoran Copper Company, where they're trying to open the reopen the historic pit, as well as explore some of the other pieces around there. Mineral Park, which is now held by Origin Mining, which is a subsidiary of Waterton Copper, has been quietly advancing back towards production. In October of last year, they announced that they were investing $115 million into a silver stream at the mine. And from what I hear, we can expect Mineral Park to be reopened come spring 2025. Additionally, we should be thinking about mine waste. Porphyry copper deposits are large geochemical systems. That same fluid that moved copper around also moved a bunch of other metals, and those vary in concentration across deposits and within deposits. A really good copper mine in Arizona is 1% copper. That means 99% of the rock mass is waste. If we could figure out how to get extra metals out of that 99%, we could significantly reduce our dependence on international sources of critical minerals. That could also tackle waste streams. So you could do this by tackling waste streams so that we never even put them in waste piles, or you can reprocess these waste piles so that we can get metals out of them again. So if we prevent it from being waste, here's a figure that Peter Vickery and others at the USGS put together at the end of last year, where they're just looking at several different critical minerals and where they're typically wasted in the copper mining process. And we often will see things like aluminum, titanium, tungsten, zircon, hafnium, arsenic, bismuth, germanium, tin, tellurium, and antimony that is often wasted. Sometimes we can recover it depending on which deposit or facilities they're going through. But really, this is probably the best way we could be increasing critical mineral production and doing it in an environmentally sound manner. This reduces environmental liability because if you don't ever put it on a waste pile and you use it instead, that's one less thing you have to care about over time, instead of having to monitor it for the next 100 years. We're already doing this with moly. We're already doing this with uranium. We should be doing this with other metals. Another figure they put together that I really liked, so each one of these series of bar graphs, they're showing the relative metal flux that they thought for critical minerals that went through these different, from different refineries. So from Mission, from Ray, Bingham Canyon, from Freeport's facilities in 2020, from old data from Phelps Dodge for Globe Miami, and for San Manuel Kalamazoo. The horizontal lines are showing the annual domestic demand for these metals every year. So if you could just from several of these mines recover these metals, you could very easily meet total US demand for some of these critical minerals that we don't need that much of, but we have a hard time finding primary supplies for. Another way we can handle this is look at reprocessing copper mine tailings. And this is actually a large project that the Arizona Board of Regents funded a lot of us at the University of Arizona, as well as at ASU and at NAU to look at, where we're just looking at what are the critical mineral potential within copper tailings. So this is trying to get an estimate on what the volumes or mass of materials, what are their compositions, what are the contents of critical minerals there, can you recover them, and indeed are these economically viable? And we're just coming up to the 1 year, and this is the 3-year project here, and it's led by Isabel Barton and Mining Engineering. So wrapping up, a lot of the mines in the western United States were found thanks to federal subsidies that encouraged domestic mineral exploration in the 1940s and 50s. We have a national record of moving quickly when we need to obtain resources. The actual operations of those mines, however, are largely dictated by global economics. Mines are designed to operate at a certain copper price, and if it gets below that, then that can cause issues. Closure, thus, is not always due to exhaustion of a resource, but due to those economic incidents. If we look at the price of copper from before COVID to now, we were looking at $2 to $3 per pound prior to the pandemic, which it quickly then spiked to $4 to $4.80, then dropped to $3.50 to $4, and it started climbing back up into the high 4s in the last few months. So what impact could this have on the active or the inactive or closed mines in Arizona? There's a number of these closed pits out there. We might be seeing more of them opening up in the coming years. Additionally, waste streams in copper mining are a great source of future source of critical minerals. The last time I gave this talk was the Department of Environmental Quality, and I completely forgot to talk about environmental impacts to them, so I made a slide after I gave the talk about that would have addressed some of their questions. So the big thing is there's obviously no panacea out here, but I will say the US has some of the strongest environmental and safety regulations for mining out there. Refusing to mine domestically does not mean mining will not occur. It is simply the offshoring of the visual and environmental effects of mining to the global south, where regulations are not as stringent. The most effective method to capture metals is obviously to capture them in the first case, when you mine the ore the first time. Add additional recovery circuits. Likely, we will need to have subsidies to put these in for a lot of places, because if they were already economic, these companies would be doing them. Reprocessing of waste holds significant potential as well, but you have to move, reprocess, and monitor large piles of rock. Those have logistical and regulatory unknowns. But the one thing that I occasionally hear talked about that we should really not consider, I think, is maybe we shouldn't use mining waste as construction material. They did that in Cornwall in the early half of the 20th century, where they took all the mine tailings and built houses and buildings out of it. It's now called Mundic Block over there, where you have a lot of natural acid drainage in your house because you have all this rain dumping down on these sulfides. So let's not do that with copper tailings. So with that, thank you, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Question for you about molybdenum. At the National Mining Museum in Leadville, they have a big exhibit about how we couldn't have won World War II without the molybdenum in the steel to harden the steel. Why in the world is it not listed as a strategic metal? You don't have it on your list at all.
Yes, so because, let's go back to this. Oh. So the big thing is the net import reliance I talked about, where the amount of material we export minus imports over consumption. It basically is telling you how much resources do you have domestically versus outside the United States, or we are dependent on them from external sources. And the fact is we get a lot of our molybdenum from domestic sources. We don't need to go elsewhere to find moly. Yes, it's strategic for military applications, but it's not critical.
But it still should be listed as a strategic metal. Why would it not be?
Well, I mean, copper is a huge debated element here. The USGS is adamant copper is not critical because we know most of our copper comes from the United States. Same thing for moly. Their definition is entirely based on are we reliant on foreign sources for it right now or not? So there are all these strategic aspects that I think you're entirely right about, but right now we're mostly looking at foreign dependence versus not.
Well, if they close down the Climax mine, then it's
that would change it, yeah.
It's a whole different ballgame.
Yes. Yes.
The numbers are very interesting in terms of what we could recover, but has the government put any value or any cost to the recovery, capital and operating costs to get all of these, materials that could be recovered from copper or whatever other mining?
Yeah.
Carson,
I'll repeat the question online.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
The remote audience cannot hear you. They absolutely can't. That was just dead silent. So Carson will repeat it. Thanks.
So the question to summarize was.
I'll repeat it.
Oh yeah, go for it.
That's
Yes.
all right. Well, the statistics are very interesting about what could be recovered. What is not in the equation, and I'm asking whether the government has looked at it, what would be the capital and operating cost to recover these minimal amount of various elements?
Good question. Short answer, no. As far as I'm aware, no one at the federal level has looked at this. It's hard enough often to kind of figure out even the production statistics and how reliant are we on foreign sources, because we don't track that well where metals go, where it comes from. But it would be
Could you get back
logically
to your copper, lithium, and chart that you had there? I come from the lithium industry, so this is why I'm curious. Yes, this orange is the lithium, I assume?
No, lithium's down here. So copper, lithium, magnet rare earths.
Oh, lithium, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, the second one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive talk. It was tremendous. You covered so many things that need to be discussed. We had a conversation recently about reclamation, and a lot of companies are trying to respect the fact that the public would like to see reclamation. In other words, they like to see nice, neat stockpiles or dumps. They like to see things groomed. They like to see things filled in, make it look proper so that the people driving by can feel comfortable about the landscape. But some of that seems to be contradictory to the notion that a stockpile or a dump or a tailings dam actually can be and probably is a large resource that needs to be actually developed and not retired. And so we're putting in a lot of money contouring and making it perfect when in fact we should be researching, leaving a lot of these features, these land features, dumps and mass waste. We should maintain access to those. We should be studying them comprehensively and identifying these things that you were talking about.
Do you want to add to that first, or do you want me to give my 2 cents?
Maybe just to follow up on this. So it is not so much covering up a pile with a layer of dirt and soil and grass and make it look nice. But what you do is you also imply the notion you're done with this, and then you bring in people who build houses around this. And it's not against people, but people are the problem for this, really, the high cost. Because these people are then going to say, not in my backyard, if you want to go back and reprocess that tailings or whatever stockpile. So it's that this added thing. And the other comment I would like to make on Dan, you can then answer both of us, is nobody knows what technology will be there in 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. And this is the same argument why we keep our drill cores. And because the company always wants to toss it. So anyway, but for these giant tailings that have a process technology from 30, 40 years ago, we just don't know in 30 years from now if there's some microbes or some pressure acid leach or some other secret sauce that you sprinkle on it, and then you can leach the last drop out of it. And so to Dan's point, I think it's really good to keep access, but the bigger picture is also populations nearby. We just went on a trip to Bisbee, and anyway, that's just a few more comments.
Yeah, so I agree. The bigger thing is, on a large scale, it's not, no one's really tackled the, how economically viable is even reprocessing. Like there haven't been that many studies on these. We don't exactly know what processing techniques we would even be using at this point. As you said, things will be changing in the future here. It is a delicate balancing act between it, but all I can really say is we have to start somewhere, and in retrospect, we always kind of look back 30 years ago and be like, why do they do this? And often we're just doing our best. But all these are valid aspects that we have to consider. Yeah.
Is there a consideration in all this government supporting the critical minerals to set aside, like we have nature reserves, have mining reserves?
I've not heard anything like that, but that is an interesting idea. Yeah. Effectively a large playground. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Well, Carson, thank you so much for this presentation. It was wonderful. You did a great job.
You're welcome.